up, guys? This episode is sponsored by Arc.io. Market Square by Arc.io released a new video recently called The Blockchains of Ready Player One. The video explains how the blockchain could power the VR experience similar to the Oasis in the movie, and how blockchain is already doing something similar today with real games, NFTs, VR, and oracles. I think this video in terms of VR and blockchain is spot on. Blockchain will become a very important tool in creating a digital economy within VR, within games, and anything that's like the Oasis. You have to have a digital economy, and the blockchain can actually help do that, and it's already starting to do that. This video does a really good job explaining how that would work, why it's important, and really puts an emphasis on it. The link to the video is in the description, so be sure to check that out, and make sure to check out the video itself, The Blockchains of Ready Player One. Awesome. Justin, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Where are you based at?
I'm based in Kingston, New York, which is 100 miles due north of New York City. It's like in the Hudson Valley at the foot of the Catskill Mountains.
Oh, is that like upstate New York or?
Yeah, upstate. It's actually interesting. If you live in where I live, there are people who say this is not upstate. That upstate's like Albany or the Adirondacks. For people who live in New York City, when they say upstate New York, this is what they mean.
Where's that located in relation to like Wappinger Falls? I have at least one friend that lives kind of in that area.
It is across the river and about 30 miles north.
Okay, cool. But I heard it's really nice up there. You guys get like good seasons and everything?
Oh yeah, I mean we get seasons, many of which are good. It was a brutal winter, and it can be, but it's kind of nice. Like if you like that kind of thing, which I do. Yeah, you get a really good spring, summer, and fall, and then you have a slightly brutal winter that makes you appreciate it all.
Yeah, do you guys actually get what are you guys at with the lockdown there? Like, is it still restricted or is it a little bit more open upstate?
Upstate and New York in general was fully locked down for 3 months about a year ago, from March through June, and then in phases there was places opened, and at the moment where I am, almost everything is fairly open. Like there's limited indoor dining and limited indoor seating at bars and stuff like that. And I personally feel a little too freaked out to like be eating indoors. But it's fairly, there's enough space up here where it's not like you're not like crammed on top of each other. So there's a lot of opportunity to just kind of like be outside, and businesses in general are pretty much open with limited capacity.
Okay, well that's good. I heard you guys got hit pretty hard through the pandemic, so
That's
hopefully
true.
everything's starting to open up at least a little bit more.
Yeah,
Anyways,
and people are getting vaccines up here too. It's like slowly trickling out. I mean, it feels like, I don't want to say, well, I'll just say light at the end of the tunnel. Why not? Feels like we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Or what it feels like is that it's all also coinciding with like spring happening. So there's some hope. There's hope where before there was grimness.
gotcha. Well, hopefully everything starts getting better soon. It's actually not too bad here. I'm in Colombia, and everything's kind of just opened up. Everyone's at this point just said fuck it, and it's, you can pretty much do whatever you want. So I'm lucky in that sense, I guess. I know other places like the UK are like really, really strict still.
Yeah. We're somewhere in between.
Yeah. Anyways, tell me a little bit about your background and yourself, because my audience is probably going to wonder, like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
What does he do with Stellar? So tell me a little bit about yourself, how you came to work with the foundation, and what should people know about you?
I am the head of ecosystem at the Stellar Development Foundation. What that means is that my team and I, we work with the companies and developers building on Stellar, as well as with the vibrant community of Stellar enthusiasts. And our goal is to try to make it so that anyone can sort of do anything that they want on the network. There's great resources, there's great education. We're helping people strategize and grow their businesses and really make optimal use of the Stellar network. So we're sort of out there dealing with the people who build on Stellar, the ecosystem, and helping
Mhm.
them thrive and grow. Because the Stellar Development Foundation is an organization, a nonprofit that supports in the growth of the actual Stellar network, but the network itself isn't something that we own, right? It's open source, it's open participation. So our goal is like really to basically be like Sherpas for this public network. I got here in a weird roundabout way. I mean, before working here, I also worked. I worked at a dating website for I don't know a lot of years, where I was also doing stuff that related to community. Um, Before that, I for a long time had just like a lot of different jobs. I'd say that for about 10 to 15 years, I either was making music or working on music. I was in a band. We toured, I produced records and worked on soundtracks, or I was working in film production where I kind of did a little bit of everything. So like weirdly, I started out freelancing doing film and music, ended up working in the tech sector, and then sort of discovered blockchain. It took a lot of what I learned about the building community and building stuff from the ground and being scrappy and like sort of brought it to a role where a nonprofit network helps or a nonprofit organization helps a network to sort of build effects and get people going and give them the resources they need to build.
That sounds like you've done quite a lot of stuff. What got you interested in blockchain? Like why work in this industry? Is just the excitement behind it, the energy, or
I was interested in blockchain for a long time before I started working at SDF. And it was, like a lot of people, it's probably around 2015, 2016 when I first heard about it. I actually heard about it via Jed, who is the sort of founder and chief architect of Stellar.
Mhm.
Um, and he's someone that I've known for a while, and he was super enthusiastic about it. And it seemed like such a crazy, weird idea. So I was always reading about it and just interested in it. It did not at first occur to me that I could like work in blockchain. I know that it feels like there's so much that people can do to work in blockchain, whatever that means now. But at that
Mhm.
time when he was telling me about it, it just seemed like a far out idea that I got into, and it sort of jibed with the stuff that I was interested in, right? Like I said, I was a musician, and we would record our own records and book our own tours and be out there just like building stuff. And the way that where sort of blockchain is right now, it's at that stage, right? Anyone can come build on it. It's just about like digging in and understanding and figuring it out. And that sort of DIY scrappiness of early blockchain is what attracted me to it.
What makes Jed so excited about Stellar? Like, is it just everything that it can do in terms of its utility, or is it its future potential or partnerships, or like what? Why is he so excited about it?
I think that there are I think there are two reasons. The first is that I think just that the idea of the technology is interesting to him.
Hmm.
I think it's someone who sort of thinks about puzzles and tries to build solutions. The whole idea that you could transform money using ingenuity was interesting and got him going. But I think the thing that sort of keeps him going, and I'm sort of speaking for him, so I
For
might
sure.
be wrong, right? He might have a better answer, but from my interactions with him and from what I understand, the thing that keeps him going is actually the mission. So SDF, which is what I'll henceforth call the Stellar Development Foundation, SDF is driven by a mission, which is to increase equitable access to the world's financial infrastructure. And I think the idea that you can take this ingenuity, apply it to actual money, to value, and find a way to help the world like actually achieve a better like become a better place is what drives him, and I think most of us at SDF
Hmm.
to get up every day is what we're passionate about. So it's those two things, like blockchain is interesting and Stellar is poised to actually make a difference in the real world.
Yeah, wasn't he like formerly like at Ripple? Like he was he a co-founder or something?
Yeah, he was the co-founder of Ripple. Mm-hmm.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I space all these details. There's so many projects in this space, you just can't keep up with everything.
That is so true. There is so much. It's just like a fire hose. And some of it's really
Mhm.
interesting and legit. And there's also just a lot of like, there's a lot of posturing and vaporware out there too. And so
Sure.
being able to like just take in all that information and understand what's important and also just like keep the trivia in your mind, like who founded what.
Hmm.
I mean, that's sort of trivial, but it's a difficult task. I don't think anyone's
Exactly.
totally up to it.
Well, I guess us podcasters are up to it. That's our job. We're trying to make it easier for you guys.
Great, good, yeah, exactly. This is how you talk about it, figure it
Hmm.
out. You ask the questions, people listen, they learn. Yeah.
Exactly. How does the foundation support the network? Like, what's the primary role you guys play in like doing that?
We steward the code base. So fundamentally, if you talk about the network, it's Stellar Core, which is the program that runs the Stellar Consensus Protocol and allows all the nodes on the network to interact, to communicate, and to keep a common ledger and ratify and add
Hmm.
transactions to it. So Stellar Core is like sort of the core of the network. We
Hmm.
maintain that code base, as well as there's an API layer called Horizon that we maintain also. Um, and then also we have other projects that add tooling to make it easier to build on Stellar. So there's this idea of something called an anchor in the Stellar vernacular, which are basically like regulated financial institutions that connect real world banking infrastructure to the network to serve as on-off ramps for value. So we also build things like a reference implementation of the servers necessary to do that, called Polaris. So Stellar Core, Horizon, and Polaris are three examples of code that open source code, right? So anyone can contribute to it, but we sort of steward it, shepherd it, maintain it, and help move the code along and make sure that it works. I'd say in addition to that, we support the ecosystem by providing educational materials and documentation, resources, and also grants to help them build on Stellar and optimize their use of Stellar. And then third, we serve as like a speaking partner to regulators and legislators as we sort of talk about the future of blockchain. So
Okay. Well, here's like an interesting question that's kind of been in the back of my mind for a while. What gives like the foundation, or I guess a foundation for like any of these, crypto projects out there, the ability to maintain and, update the code base? Does it just like having enough nodes to do so, or enough people involved to submit proposals? Like, how does that process work? Maybe that's kind of technical, but I'm,
sure, I
I'm
mean,
curious.
Stellar is open source. And what is an open source project? It's basically a code that anyone can audit or add
Hmm.
to, contribute to, or install for free. And the literal mechanics of that are we have a GitHub repos, right? So GitHub is a service that hosts open source code repositories. So if you go to the Stellar GitHub, you'll see the repositories. And essentially, anyone can comment on those repositories, ask questions, make proposals, or even file pull requests to change the code.
Hmm.
Ultimately, a handful of people have the ability to merge pull requests to actually change the code. And those people currently are work for the Stellar Development Foundation. Now, so like in terms of what gives us the ability to access the code, anyone can do it. The ability to merge it is something that was granted by the administrator of those GitHub repos. In terms of what the network actually runs, like we can propose this open source code and we can make changes to it. The network itself um, decides what version, for instance, of Stellar Core, which again is that fundamental underlying code, that's an implementation of the Stellar protocol. The network decides what version of that to run. And that happens because validators on the network basically vote. So the typical process is that we there's an idea to sort of change or augment Stellar Core to add new features to Stellar, say. And that idea
Hmm.
sometimes comes from SDF, sometimes comes from someone in the ecosystem. It goes through a process where it gets like proposed, discussed, and then a change gets accepted and implemented into a code. And then that code will be bundled up into a major Stellar Core release that we will then put forth to the network for a vote. So we'll say, here's the new version of Stellar Core. Here's what it adds. Take a look. A lot of the people who are running validators have been involved in the creation of that code or auditing of that code from the beginning. So they kind of know what it is that they're looking at. And then ultimately, the validators on the network will vote on whether to accept that change or not.
How smooth, I guess, is that process with Stellar versus like other projects out there? Because I know others, like take Ethereum for example, it takes them forever to approve like anything and get anything done with Ethereum, get any updates put out. But like with Stellar, is that a little bit more streamlined for you guys? Are you guys able to push things out in a more reasonable amount of time, or what's it kind of like?
I think in general there are challenges to making changes at the core level, at the protocol level of any network, and that's
Hmm.
because if you break something, it has serious consequences, right? It not only can someone lose real value, or you can introduce some bug or exploit, but also generally a change has serious downstream effects, right? So you make a breaking change to code, and everything that's built on that code also has to change to be prepared, right? So if we make a change to Stellar Core, the Stellar API has to change, and all the Stellar SDKs have to change, and all the products built on Stellar generally have to, at the very least, update their SDKs, sometimes make actual changes. So the process has to be slow because not only are you trying to make sure that the changes are really safe, but you also have to broadcast in big gestures, um, and let people know that the changes are happening so they can prepare to make changes downstream. So I think any protocol runs into some. They're not super swift moving changes to the protocol. Um, I think with Stellar we can move a little faster than certain other blockchains. Um, I would say, last year I think we released two. It's generally about three major protocol upgrades per year. So, about once a quarter, a little less than once a quarter sometimes. But it depends on what change is being proposed and the actual complexity and then the impact that it has downstream. So I would say, major Stellar Core updates and network upgrades happen a few times a year.
Yeah. Are there any updates that you guys are working on right now that are notable?
Yeah, the next major protocol upgrade, which will be to protocol version 16 of Stellar Core v 16.0.0, is probably going to be out in about a month. Um,
Hmm.
and when I say out, that means that we will release the production ready version of the software, and then there'll be some time where it gets deployed to the Stellar test network, and then time for the sort of whole ecosystem to prepare. And then, say, a month after that, it will be voted on. Like the validators will vote whether to upgrade the public network. So again, that release is coming out, I believe, sometime in April. I mean, give or take. And
Hmm.
the that introduces a new um, feature to Stellar called uh, asset clawback, which basically on Stellar Stellar is set up so that anyone can issue an asset, right? Like assets are basically a primitive of the Stellar code. It's not a smart contract thing. An account can issue an asset and just send that, make payments. You know, it's built into Stellar. Those assets can actually the issuer can set certain flags, authorization flags, and right now there are two. One is auth required, which basically says the issuer of an asset, have to authorize an account before the account can hold the asset. There's also one called auth revocable, which says I can issue. I can give permission for an account to hold an asset, and I can also revoke it, so that they can no longer transact in that asset. And we're adding this clawback feature, which is basically a clawbackable flag, off clawbackable. Um, and it says, I'm issuing an asset. It has this clawback feature enabled. That means that I can, an account can hold it, and at some point I can also claw it back from that account, take it away from that account. And
Hmm.
it's necessary, for a number of reasons, basically a lot of which have to do with issuing regulated assets on the network. So this off clawbackable feature, the asset clawback, will make it so that people who want to issue regulated assets and have to comply with regulatory requirements can do that on Stellar quite easily. I do want to point out, like, because sometimes people hear that and they're like, "Oh, that's really freaky." All of those flags are really obvious to a user, right? So an asset has that flag; it's quite visible, and a user has to basically agree. They have to say, "Okay, I'm going to hold this asset. I see the flag. I agree to hold it. I'm okay with that." And you can't just like apply these asset authorization flags to assets that users already hold. So this is a very specific kind of asset authorization that allows for a very specific kind of asset to be issued on the network that it wasn't so easy to issue before.
Okay, so that allows for like I guess a recall of an asset if it doesn't fit like a certain regulatory scope, if it gets like released and like there's an issue or something like that.
Yeah, I think sometimes when you're issuing, and I think just looking into local regulations would is probably a good idea if anyone wants to delve into this. But there are situations where regulators will say, this you have to be able to have this enabled. Like you have to be able to claw
Mhm.
back assets, and whether or not because, and the reasons might be because of the local regulations about who can hold a certain kind of asset that may, for
Mhm.
instance, change. It may be about assets that are distributed incorrectly to the wrong people, to people who shouldn't be holding them. This feature also makes it possible to for people to reclaim assets if they've lost access to an account. And so, essentially, my answer is certain in certain jurisdictions for certain kinds of assets, regulations will require this functionality in order to be compliant.
Okay. Can you think of like an example of like a use case for that? Or do you guys have an example maybe off the top of your head?
I mean, I think this would apply to something like a Reg D asset, so something that requires an accredited investor to hold it. So
Mhm.
there are certain kinds of funds that are securities and they're not publicly traded, um, that you can tokenize, but you can't just
Mhm.
let anyone hold them.
Gotcha. And when I think recall, I always think of like those salmonella outbreaks, and they do recalls on like eggs and food like that. So I'm wondering if you could like tokenize like eggs, and then they could do like a recall on the tokens for the eggs because they're not accurate, validating that they don't have salmonella.
Yeah. Hey, why not? At the SDF, we usually talk about Stellar and how useful it is for cross-border payments,
Hmm.
and for connecting financial infrastructure. But in reality, you can issue any kind of token on Stellar, right? Like you can issue an egg token.
Hmm.
You could use the auth claw backable flag and, and deal with your tokenized salmonella in some weird way.
Yeah, maybe. Have you guys seen interest outside of remittance? Because I know XLM is kind of focused on that, but like in terms of I guess other assets being built on the Stellar network, are there other people kind of experimenting with different use cases outside of just sending value and remittance and things like that?
Yes, as I mentioned, you can tokenize anything on Stellar, and
Hmm.
I would say that one great example is a company called DStock. They offer stocks, and they offer stocks that are tokenized on Stellar, so you can get Apple and Tesla and Google stocks, tokenized versions of them, and they offer them. Their product really gives access to those stocks to people in developing economies.
Okay, gotcha. How do I guess okay, in terms of building on Stellar and getting more people to want to build on Stellar and launch assets and tokenize and do things like that, how does Stellar stack up versus um, other projects in the space?
Um, well, Stellar has certain advantages, I would say, that make it better for certain use cases. So again, Stellar is pretty finely tuned for payments and for exchange of value. And I
Hmm.
would say one, it's incredibly easy to issue an asset on Stellar and safe to do so. Like it doesn't require smart contracts or coding. There's not a lot of attack surfaces. It's a you can in just a few lines of code issue an asset. Two, it's also easy because in addition to the network itself, there are these great ecosystem standards that make it easy to set up infrastructure to connect that asset, basically to connect existing banking rails, for instance, to the Stellar network so that you can easily build an on-off ramp. You can accept user deposits, tokenize them, accept those tokens as withdrawals and give people money back. So those connections are well defined, and a lot of people sort of build them following standard protocols. And so it makes it easy for anyone to connect to the network either by issuing an asset and building those connections. It also makes it easy for someone who's an app developer to build like a single client that can consume those APIs, so that they can very easily in sort of one integration plug into all the different assets on Stellar. Three, Stellar is also has built into it a decentralized exchange, which means that you can put buy and sell offers out, and they're aggregated in books, and the protocol itself um, matches offers and executes trades when they cross. And so what that means is that you can, by plugging in, automatically not only create tokenized value or access all the different tokens, but you can really easily, at a protocol level, exchange them, which makes it easy to transmute or convert currency. And then in addition, I think Stellar is super cheap. Transactions are, fractions of a cent. It's super fast. It basically ledgers close every 3 to 5 seconds, so you don't have to wait a long time for blocks to confirm.
Mm-hmm.
And it also is environmentally friendly. It doesn't rely on proof of work, so it relies instead on a protocol, the Stellar Consensus Protocol, and it's sort of this federated series of voting between validators. And it just because no one's trying to solve impossible problems, there's not this huge overhead of electricity, and therefore the environmental footprint is a lot smaller than proof of work systems.
How fast are we talking?
How fast?
Yeah.
Like transactions, like every ledger closes in 3 to 5 seconds, and transactions are final. So 3 to 5 seconds.
Okay, that sounds about right. I've always kind of used Stellar to transfer things back and forth because it just gets there really quickly, like really, really fast. I've had never really had. I don't think I've ever sent XLM somewhere and it arrived later than about 5 or 6 seconds. Like it's pretty damn fast.
Yeah, and that's been true even as like more and more transactions have been applied to the network. So this sort of scaling of transactions and the increased throughput of the network hasn't really affected network latency. It's just kind of clicking along like a metronome.
Does that change if you have to scale up the network for use, or does like scaling slow it down at all? I know that's an issue with other projects. Has Stellar, kind of found a way to solve that issue, or?
Well, it's actually a difficult question to answer because the answer isn't straightforward. It's more like a complicated graph with like a lot of different factors.
Sure.
Because there are at least two different factors. One is essentially the number of transactions that are competing for ledger space, and the second is the topology of the network. Basically, how many validating nodes there are, how they're arranged, and how long it takes them to work together to build transaction sets. Generally, where we are right now, and where we will be for a really long time, Stellar has no issues continuing to close ledgers at 3 to 5 seconds. I mean, activity on the network has increased 100-fold over the past 5 years, and we're not even close to getting to a point where there's any recognizable or measurable or consistent. Like it's still consistent throughput, and the time, the latency has still been consistent. Now, on Stellar, there is a ledger limit. Like there's a limit to the number of operations that can be applied to a given ledger. And that limit is also set by the validators. So just like they vote on what version of the protocol or the code to run, they also vote on where to set ledger limits. And their goal is to try to set those limits at a place where there's enough throughput so that everyone who wants to use the network can, and to balance that with making it so that anyone can run a Stellar validator without requiring specialized hardware, so the network is accessible to everyone in the world to participate in. And right now the ledger limits are set at 1,000 ops per ledger. So I guess when I say there are those two factors, throughput and network topology, they could increase the ledger limits, and the number of validators on the network could grow, and both of those things could potentially affect latency, and that's true in any blockchain. But as of right now, everything that we've ever done, we've managed to keep that steady 3 to 5 second ledger closed.
Has it ever been an issue in the past, or has it just never really gotten to that point?
I don't think it's been an issue in the past. I don't think it's gotten to a point where it is an issue. And I mean, again, I think that at some point you're talking about theoretical, mathematical, and principles of computing, and there may be, like, if you dig into the Stellar white paper, there are sections that like have these complicated graphs that talk about ledger about this latency, but it's just like for the foreseeable future, I think that we could increase the number of transactions a lot without having without it impacting the amount of time it takes to close the ledger.
Yeah. So, like, let's say an institution or a large corporation or I don't know, a government wanted to build some kind of application or do a massive tokenization project with Stellar. Um, and, they're expecting tons and tons of transactions, more than normal that would be on the Stellar network. You think the network be able to handle that without too many issues right away? Or do you think it still needs to grow a bit more to like handle that type of volume that we'd be talking about?
Well, I think right now it's handling the volume that is thrown at it without any issues. Is there a theoretical? I'm sure that there is a theoretical limit to the number of transactions that Stellar, like any network, can handle. I don't know exactly what it is.
Hmm.
Like in your analogy, I guess it would depend, or in your question, I guess it would depend on how exactly how, if they were throwing 190 billion transactions. I don't know.